All right, so we're here. This is 126, and we're near the end of this class, like all of them. So I'll talk about malware behavior. I'm going to quit at 8 o'clock tonight because I have to go to a conference call for CPTC, which happens this weekend, the pen testing contest down at Stanford. So, but anyway, I'll be here till 8, so I'll talk about malware behavior and then demonstrate these IDA Pro projects, 303 and 304, which are the last so-called required projects of the semester. And so let's take a look at that. That's here. And it seems like we've already covered quite a bit of this in other sections, so this be to some extent a review, I think. All right. But anyway, so downloaders are software, malware that downloads more malware, which is often the case. Many of the Metasploit attacks are staged, where you get a first stage and it'll download another stage, and so they'll use the Windows API. Usually, you'd use the high-level thing, URL download to file, called by WinExec to run the file. That would be the easiest way to do it. You could use lower-level direct access to sockets or something, but that would be a lot of extra work. Then there's launchers that prepare another piece of malware for execution. These are quite common, and you'll see a lot of the examples in your textbook, which I didn't assign as homework, have this, where it's got malware in another place. You have a program, and in a data section is another program, which it loads and launches. That's quite commonly done, and that can fool a lot of antivirus engines. And then, of course, backdoors give you some kind of remote access to the machine. This is the most common thing because it's the universal answer. If I have remote access to your machine, I can just do anything. So they often communicate over HTTP or some other protocol and just try to disguise their traffic as normal network traffic, so they'll make it through your firewalls and such. And then you can, manipulate the registry, install software, search your files, and so on. A reverse shell is what they typically make. Now, you can make a reverse shell with just command line. You make it outgoing. You start listening on port 80 for incoming commands, and then you export cmd.exe here. And anyway, there's one shell going one way and one shell going the other way. So you can send commands, and the answers come out through a different channel. This is called a reverse shell, and that's what most malwares do, because forward shells are blocked by the firewall, where you send an unexpected SYN to an unexpected port. So you send an outgoing traffic from the Windows machine to the server, because typically the firewall will let you have outgoing traffic to anyone, and then you can get replies to that. So that's the way to make a connection. So if you want to make a reverse shell in Windows, you can create a process, create a socket, tie the socket to standard input, output, and error, and then create a process. That's the way to make a basic shell, the only kind I've ever used. You could make a multi-threaded shell. I don't know why you would do this, unless you have multiple users to be using the same infected machine, but maybe for something complicated you'd do this, and then you'd have to make pipes in addition to, and threads. And you'd see different calls there. There are remote administration tools, of course. You'll have a command and control server, and then you'll have a bunch of machines down here controlling. I think this is some kind of logical diagram, meaning something else. I don't quite understand their labels, but the point is, this is commonly the case that you have victim machines you're controlling from a server. And so a botnet is what you do when you infect a lot of machines and control many machines from one location to do something unified, like a DDoS, where many machines attack the same website at the same time. A RAT, you typically control one host at a time, remote access tool, where it's something like a server and you're remotely administering it. And these are often used for legitimate purposes, but I think they only call them RATs, remote access Trojans, if they're on there without legitimate purpose. And of course, everybody controls every server remotely these days with RDP or some other solution. And RATs are just other ways to do it. A lot of people use legitimate tools as RATs. There's a famous one with a blue, I used to use it all the time. A blue remote access tool. I can't remember the name of it anymore because they made it hard to use for free services anymore. But there was a very common free one you'd use for that would give you remote control of a machine so you could help people that needed help. And a lot of people built it into malware. They pirate a copy. Anyway, then there's credential stealers. You can wait for the user to log in and steal the keystrokes, or steal the credentials, or steal the keystrokes, or you can find stored data like password hashes. These are all ways to steal credentials, and this is one of the main things you always do. It's in the attack framework as one of the things every attacker will do, is try to get credentials to do lateral movement through your network. GINA is something that Windows XP had, so you could have alternate login techniques like RFID or smart cards, and you could intercept it by attacking this msgina.dil. So they went out a registry key that had third-party DILs to be loaded by WinLogon, and you could just add extra things there. and it would then load these extra libraries for the graphical login, and you could then do things like maliciously record the login credentials that went by. All right, and so you'd have to export all functions just like we did in some of the projects here, where you make a good DIL proxy to do this. Now, anyway, here's what it would look like. At 2, it calls the, exports will call through to the real function. So this is the export function. And here it's going to log, here it's going to call the malicious DIL, and here it's going to log it to a file. So it logs the credentials that go by. Now, Gina is no longer used in any modern version of Windows, but there's a new thing called credential providers, and it has similar vulnerabilities. And there is at least one example from a few years ago of a rootkit on Windows 7 that would make 2 sets of login buttons, one that goes to the real login and the other that goes to something that steals it on the way to the real login. And there was some way to make one of these hidden. So there are ways to attack the new one, but of course it's harder to attack. Then there's hash dumping, the old tool. Inside your Windows system, passwords are stored as these hashes. These LM hashes are not used by any modern version of Windows. They're just useless placeholder that's always the same. But the NT hashes are Microsoft's hash, unfortunately dating from 1993, so it is 1 round of MD4 on a Unicode password. So if 2 machines have the same, 2 accounts have the same password, then they'll both have the same hash. And you can just Google this hash to crack it in most cases. It's ridiculously easy to crack these hashes. They are literally 1 million times weaker than Linux passwords or Apple password hashes. Anyway, that's where they are, and you can get these files by attacking a running machine. So there's various ways to do it. You want to get these hashes. Now you can just use the hash without cracking it as network authentication in a Microsoft network. That's the pass the hash attack, which still works, which is pretty ridiculous. And then there's a bunch of toolkits, pwdump and pass the hash toolkit. These are tools that will provide hash dumping. They just will find the hashes, and you can modify them to pass antivirus. pwdump injects a DIL into the LSAS service because it's privileged enough to see the hashes. That's one way to do it. You're trying to get into the security account manager. Another way is pwdump, that inserts a DIL into LSASS calling getHash. And there's variants that use samserve.dil and addvapi32.dil and so on. Makes this thing called samigetprivatedata to extract the hashes, and then you have to decrypt them. There's a thing called syskey encryption in Windows machines where a layer of symmetric encryption is added to the password hashes to protect them, but the key is available in the memory, so there are tools that find the key and decrypt it, and so it's kind of silly. And so here's what happens. What pwdump is, it calls this DIL and that DIL to load them. Then it calls sami-connect, query user, get private data, and then it calls these system functions, which decrypt the encrypted data. All right. And here's another one called who's there, alt, which is going to be in the pass the hash toolkit. So it's going to call enumerate login sessions and then get module handle. So it's using different API functions, but it amounts to the same thing. It's finding the hash and using them for lateral motion over the network. So let's try a Kahoot, which is 11A, which is here. Violence tonight. All right. All right, so where is poison ivy? Discussed it, I think, in an earlier chapter and in your book. That's a rat. It's a famous rat from the Windows XP days. Really only of historical interest, but people do learn about it to compare it to the modern ones. All right. All right, so which one will store malware in the resource section? Yep, those are launchers. All right. All right, which one will cause the infected machine to send a SYN out to the attacker? Well, that's a reverse shell. Yep, makes a reverse connection from the inside. I suppose technically a downloader sort of does the same thing, but anyway, the most direct answer is reverse shell. All right, what technique is no longer possible in Windows? Yep, Gina is no longer used. All right, which one puts a DIL into LSASS? Yep, both of these do. Both of these rely on injecting DILs into the local security authority subsystem to get the privileges to see the password hashes. I think we know who Karen is. All right, so your key logging, you can have it in the kernel as part of a rootkit. So it's going to act like a keyboard driver, and that's one place to hide from most protections. But you normally have it in user land, and then it's going to use the Windows API to detect key presses, and it's going to do it with either hooking or polling. Hooking is the simpler one. Yeah, there were three answers. Yeah, if someone's asking a question about the Kahoot, there were two. One of them was Gina interception, and that does not involve injecting a DIL into LSASS. I don't think so. That's different. Yeah, yeah, good. All right, so the user space keyloggers, we'll see you're hooking or polling. Hooking is where you use a hook function, which will cause it, every time it detects a key, to go call this additional function. And then polling is the more difficult way, where you keep strobing through the keys. Is this key down? Is this key down? Is this key down? And you keep racing around among them to detect when the key is down. More complicated, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So get async key state will tell you whether a key is pressed or not. You can identify the window, because, of course, getting a key press is not much use unless you know what window was active at that time. And then you just repeat this frequently enough to catch all the keystrokes. So you find out, you get foreground window, and then you log if the window changes. Then you check the key, check shift and cap. Then you go to the next key and the next key and the next key, zipping around. And then you go around and do this over and over and over. That's we're running around finding your key logs. Yeah, good. All right. So one thing you'll find is it has to record all that in the logs. It will typically have something like this to record the presence of these keys. So that just the strings would show you the presence of a keylogger unless they have obfuscated this stuff. All right, and then persistence mechanisms to survive a reboot. The simplest one is the run key that will automatically run every time you restart, but there's many other ways to do it, like app init dills, service host dills, or winlog on notify. You can also Trojan binaries, and you can use dill loadout or hijacking, which we've done. These are many ways to get persistence. And so here's the run key in the registry. This will automatically launch every time you start. There's also run once, and there are many others, and auto runs will find them. Procmon will show these modifications. If you do dynamic analysis, and we've done that, Procmon will show you all these registry changes being made. So it's a very nice way to find it, as long as you can trick the malware into running in your virtual machine and analyze its what it does. And then app init dills, we've talked about. These are things that present information to the user, so they're added to every process that loads user 32, and there's just a list of dills here in the registry. So you can just add a malicious dill there, and you can put malware in dill main the way Metasploit would, and it will then run it when it loads. So they're disabled by default, but you can, I think, turn them back on. Now it supports code signing, which is nice. So you can hopefully run signed code. I hope it actually enforces it, which, as we've seen, Microsoft Windows does not enforce code signing as much as you might hope. According to Windows 8, this Windows 8 is disabled if secure boot is enabled, so that's an issue. It's probably not a bad idea. Now, of course, there's a brand of computer, I think it's Samsung now, that all their stuff, you can turn off the secure boot remotely. There's a vulnerability in the whole product line. So that's another fun thing to know about. Of course, that's not intentional, but that's something that can be hard for them to fix, I think. All right, and so here's one in winlog on notify. These are things to handle Windows logon events. So this is where you would put malware to catch original logons, even when it launches in a safe mode. So you don't have to wait till you log on. Now, the run key, I think, will only take effect after you log in. So anyway, I'm not sure. The run key might take effect when you boot up. Startup scripts will only take effect when you log in. I have to try it to see. But anyway, this is another thing you can do. You can add extra libraries to the logon events. And then there's service host dills that we've talked about many times. This runs the background services. Many copies of SVC host are running at the same time. Each of them have many libraries injected, and they're defined in the registry. And they're set into groups. And so if you look in Process Explorer, you'll see all these SVC host processes. And if you hover over one, you'll see like this one process is running all these services, like a dozen or more. And so you can just add your malicious service to one of them, and it'll just launch and run in the background like all the rest. Of course, you have to have administrator privileges to make those registry changes. And here in registry, you can go in here and you can see the SVC host key. And here's a list of all the groups, like net SVCS is the one we saw on the previous slide, all the network services. And it just has a list here of all the things to launch. So it's not hard to do. Same thing, app init dills look just the same. All right, and so the service host has a parameters key with a service dill value, and the service dill value specifies the dill that's going to be loaded. So you can just make it point to any library you can inject. You can add yourself to a group, or you could override a non-vital service. Either one is fine. As we've seen, there's always a ton of services running on a Windows machine that don't really matter and you're not using them. That's the problem with Windows being the all-purpose operating system. It's running all sorts of extra junk you don't need, so you can make that stuff malicious and it really won't matter. All right, and so you can monitor the registry or look for functions like create service in the disassembly. You'll see that your malware does create a service. All right, now let's take a look at 11B. All right. that's pretty cool. You got the inverse video. Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's true. Thanksgiving coming up. Yeah. There's not too much of that. I think it's true of anything that has been through many generations. It becomes really chaotic and hard to understand because it has pieces that are left over from an earlier age. You want something that'll drive you nuts, the phone network. Holy crap. The phone network is so complicated and so hard to understand because there's so many generations of old technology all rammed together. Well, the question is, why can't Microsoft start over from scratch? That's what Apple tries to do. If you do that, then all the people that want to run old software are hosed. And companies won't accept that. Companies are still using something written 20 years ago they don't understand it's all important for MS-DOS, and they want to keep using it. And Microsoft supports that. What's that? Well, sure. But you can tend the company. But if you want your empire to keep growing, you keep servicing your customers. And a lot of Windows customers want to use really old stuff. And so Microsoft always is backward compatible because they're oriented towards businesses. Apple doesn't care about businesses for home users. They do that. Everything more than one version back, they just abandon it. And you can do that for home users, but you can't be doing that for companies. It's a very good question. Anyway. All right, so which one is a keyboard driver? Or looks like one anyway. All right, and that's kernel mode. The key drivers are in the kernel, so that's the most common way to put in a kernel mode keylogger. All right, which one we use? Get async key state. Okay, that's pulling. That's what you'd be looping around using that to see if keys are pressed or not. All right, which one of these depends on registry manipulation? Yep, all of them. All these rely on registry manipulation. All right. All right, and which tool will record those modifications? Process Monitor, not Process Explorer. Process Monitor does it. All right. All right, and which one is loaded into every process that uses user 32? Those are the apps because they communicate with the user, so they're here. Not the services. Services don't communicate with the user directly. They don't have a visible component, but apps do. So the app init DILs are the ones that load those extra libraries. All right. And I think that's it. Nope, there's more, all right? All right, so you can also modify a system binary the way we've done before with OllyDebug and such. You can modify a binary in various ways. Now, the simplest thing, of course, is to load an extra library, but you can modify a DIL also. Just modify the entry function. Sort of jump to code inserted in an empty portion of the binary. That's one way to do it. So here, you've got the original code here where it goes to an entry point, and here's the Trojan code where you come to the same entry point, but now it jumps somewhere else. So it does something else, and then before doing this, then it'll eventually go there. So that's what you do. So then you do load order hijacking, which is what we did in the projects. There's an order for loading DILs. First, it'll start from the directory of the application loaded, then the current, then the system, the 16-bit system, a Windows directory, then the directories and a path variable. So you can put, if the real library is here in C Windows System 32, you can put one with the same name in one of these directories, and it will load it instead. So it's pretty easy to trick Windows executable into loading the wrong library, and that's the most common way you get malicious activity into it. And then there's known DILs. This is a defense against that. So in order to prevent that, if you have certain libraries are marked in the registry with a known location, and then it will not hunt for them down that path. It will just go directly to the known location for them, and that will make them load faster and prevent load order hijacking. So you can only do load order hijacking on binaries other than this that load DILs in System 32. They're not protected by known DILs. All right. And so the point is here, explorer.exe loads this from System 32. It's not a known DIL, so a malicious search is performed, so you can do it. You can load it elsewhere. And that's the problem. Known DILs is a defense, but this is true of every Microsoft defense. They have a defense, and it doesn't apply to everything. Yeah, so this part here seemed a little confusing to me, but the point is, if you're in known DILs, then it will go to the right place. Yeah, I know. This part down here didn't quite make sense. But yeah, me too. These conditions didn't really make sense. They seem to be contradicted by the next slide. I would just ignore that. I mean, the point is, if they're not in known DILs, then it'll go through the usual hunt, and that's what happened here. I don't know why it can only be used on binaries and directories other than System 32, because here it is going on one in System 32. So those conditions from the book, I do not understand them. This one here is trying to load from System 32. It's not a known DIL, so you can put it somewhere else. So obviously, you can use it on DILs that really are on System 32, and that's what we did in the project. All right, and there's a lot of them that are vulnerable. As we saw, the BG Info program was still vulnerable today, and a bunch of others. Explorer itself had 50 vulnerable DILs, at least back in the days of XP, and even the known DILs are not fully protected because the DILs load other DILs. That's why it's hard to get them all. Recursive imports. So, as we saw, DIL load order hijacking still works on modern versions of Windows, despite all this. All right. And there's a detector for this. This will search for DILs that appear multiple times and are unsigned from SANS, so that might be good. And then privilege escalation. Back in the old days, everybody ran Windows XP as administrator all the time, so there was no issue of escalation. But now, in modern versions of Windows, you run with limited privileges, and you only escalate when you have to. So there are privilege escalation exploits. Microsoft never seems to patch them. Metasploit has privilege escalation exploits that just seem to work for years. So they don't seem to take it seriously. And DIL load order hijacking is one of the many ways to do this. You inject code into a high privilege process. Another thing you can do is there are processes, you might want to escalate to administrator, and you might want to escalate above administrator up to system. SED bug privilege is another one of those high privilege accounts that you can have that require system privileges. So you can elevate to SED bug privilege is another way to do it. And you can just do it with API calls. So here's malware getting to SED bug privilege. It gets token adjust privilege to get a token handle, and then it opens the token, then it puts SED bug privilege in the parameters and calls lookup privilege value. So this obtains a token. And here, to adjust the privileges. So there is just an API call to adjust your privileges, and you can just do it. So, all right. And then there's rootkits. So user mode rootkits will try to hide things like network connections and processes. Kernel mode rootkits are more powerful, but they're much more difficult, especially these days. So the user mode rootkits typically work by IAT hooking. You can modify the import or export address table in a PE file. That's one way to do it. You modify a file so it no longer imports the correct library functions, imports different things. This is IAT hooking, so you have a legitimate program that tries to call terminate process, but you modify its import address table. Here, it's supposed to go to terminate process, which calls dill, known dill terminate, kernel32.dills terminate process. But here, with the hook, you send it somewhere else to a rootkit that does something malicious and then goes there. So that's a modified version of the program. That's one way to do it. And then there's inline hooking that overwrites the API, which is, of course, much more powerful. Here you modified one program to go the wrong place. But if you could modify the actual API call, then all the programs would get the wrong answer, and that would be much more powerful. So that you'd then attack the dills themselves. That's more advanced, but you'd modify the system dills. How do you modify a table? A table's in the header. We've seen it. You can see it with PE view, and you can just modify it with HXD. And I think we've done a little bit of that. There were some projects where you were taking things that had broken import tables and fixing them, where they had the wrong name of a dill in there and such. So I mean, you can modify the header of an executable so it loads something different. Yeah. All right, good. It's a good question. All right, let's try another Kahoot. 11C. Oh, here it is. Good. Yeah, nearly the end of the year here. All right. All right. So, which one adds malware to an empty portion of a Windows component? Yeah, that's Trojanized binaries. I tried doing this for one of the flare-ons, and I found there wasn't much of an empty portion, so I had to add an extra section to make an empty portion. All right, so what registry key will prevent load order hijacking? That's known dills, good. All right, which one had 50 vulnerable dills, at least in the days of XP? Yep, explorer.exe. It would be really easy to see if they're vulnerable. We did it. All you have to do is run process monitor and watch and see if it tries to load the dill from stupid places. And you can just watch it load the dills and see which ones it tries to load from the current directory, and you'll know which ones are vulnerable. All right. All right, which hacking tool makes privilege escalation easy? That's Metasploit, of course. Standby of ethical hackers everywhere, except the ones that can afford Cobalt Strike. All right, and which one will change function code but not pointers? This is inline hooking. All right. So, all right.